Good afternoon, everybody. I think we're about to start, so if you're here for the event, please do take your seats. So welcome, everybody, to this UN side event on climate threats and opportunities in the Horn of Africa. On behalf of UN OCHA, FAO, UNICEF, UNHCR and WFP, welcome to everybody in person and also those out there in cyberspace who I hope will be following online as well. The event is paperless, and on the sides of the room there are posters with a QR code to the event website. You can download the program there, speaker biographies and the run of show. However, I would just add that we have had a lot of changes to our speaker lineup, so if the people on the panel aren't the ones there, then I apologize for that, but you know what cops are like. We have to adapt in all ways. So just to set the scene here, whether it's flooding in Pakistan, wildfires in Europe and the United States, or hunger in sub-Saharan Africa, it's very, very clear now that the fallout of a changing climate is hitting people on the front lines, marginalized people, the hardest. And despite efforts to adapt, which are clearly not enough, climate emergencies are going to increase in number and their impact will grow in severity. This we know from the climate scientists. In Africa right now, Nigeria and Niger are experiencing significant flooding that's led to displacement, and these impacts are further exacerbated in areas that are experiencing already conflict and insecurity. But nowhere are the impacts of climate change as devastating right now as the extreme drought plaguing the Horn of Africa. This crisis is being driven by the longest and the most severe drought in recent history that is expected to continue well into 2023, and I think we're just seeing the fifth failed rainy season that has tipped 21 million people into a high level of food insecurity, and there is famine looming in Somalia. The last famine in 2011 killed 260,000 people, and it is absolutely imperative that something is done to prevent a similar situation occurring again 11 years later. So the bad news on top of that is that Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia drought response plans are only 50% funded despite the needs, and that is limiting aid agencies' capacities to respond, and clearly more funds are needed immediately to save lives. And a statistic that really impressed upon me the justice elements of what's happening now in the Horn of Africa is that people in the Horn of Africa account for only an estimated 0.59% of global greenhouse gas emissions, yet they are bearing the brunt of global warming. And so today we're going to hear from speakers from government, UN agencies and their partners and practitioners about the severity of the situation and also what can be done about this situation. And also I hope we will hear from our speakers how what is happening in the Horn of Africa can and should be reflected in the decisions made at this COP meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh. My name is Megan Rowling. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm a journalist. I work for the charitable part of Reuters News. And I have worked there for 17 years, and we started out focusing very much on humanitarian emergencies. And then it became clear that the climate crisis was going to be a bigger and bigger part of humanitarian emergencies around the world. And so this is why I'm here today, in order to hopefully raise the profile of what is happening in the Horn of Africa, which I feel has not been spoken about enough at this meeting, this COP27 summit in Egypt. So first of all, I would like to welcome Ms. Heli Uusikyla, who is the Deputy Director for Operations and Advocacy from UN OCHA, and she will deliver some welcome remarks here today. Thanks, Heli.
Thank you, Megan. Dear colleagues, dear friends, on behalf of UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or shortly OCHA, I thank you for being here today, and it shows your solidarity with the people of the Horn of Africa. This COP is an African COP. At this very moment, on this very continent, children are dying every day because of the devastating drought in parts of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. A colleague of mine in Somalia recently met a 20-year-old mother, Rukia Muhammad, whose 2-year-old son, Yusuf, has been in the hospital for a month, where he's being treated for starvation. Because of the drought, Rukia has lost her farm, her livelihood, and is worried sick about her other children, her 3 other children actually. She told my colleague, "I do not know what to hope for anymore." Despite of being responsible for less than 0.1% of global emissions, people in the Horn of Africa are paying the price for the world's selfishness. The Horn of Africa is now in the middle of its 5th consecutive failed rainy season. In just few months, there may be a 6th failed season, the likes of which we have never seen. Across the Horn of Africa, the worst drought in 4 decades has left 21 million people barely able to access a meal per day, and nearly 24 million people with no water. More than 1.7 million people have been forced to leave their homes in search of food, shelter, water, alternative livelihoods. For children, the effect of hunger on their physical and mental development can last a lifetime. The number of people at risk of dropping out of school across Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia has tripled just in 3 months, leaving large number of teenage girls at increased risk of gender-based violence and being forced into early marriage. As you know, most of the people in the region are pastoralists. This cyclical drought poses an existential threat to their way of life and the storage culture of millions of people in the region and elsewhere in Africa. And the science is clear. As the climate crisis escalates, people in the Horn of Africa will face more frequent and extreme weather events with little time to recover between the crises. As people across the region confront one of the most catastrophic events of their generation, we are doing our best to ease their sufferings. This year, humanitarian partners have reached at least 17 million people with at least one form of assistance in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia, working closely with the affected communities and the governments. Since 2021, UN Central Emergency Fund SURF, which OCHA manages, has allocated 133 million to respond to the drought in the Horn of Africa, and nearly 150 million has been allocated to the country-based pool funds in Ethiopia and Somalia. But funding is falling far too short of the needs. We have appealed 3.7 billion for emergency assistance for people affected by drought in the region this year, but so far we have received $2.1 billion. When we do not receive the funds we need, we have to make impossible decisions. We are forced to prioritize the most vulnerable people, but often at the expenses of others who also need urgent support. 2 districts in Somalia are already on the brink of famine, and many others will follow. At the same time, we know that much more is required beyond an emergency response. The people and communities who have been hardest hit by drought are the human face of global climate crisis. They deserve not our sympathy, but our solidarity as they endure crisis not of their making. They urgently need climate financing to be unlocked to enable them to adapt to the changing climate and build their resilience for their difficult road ahead. As we go together at COP27 today, we are already 27 years behind the taking decisive action to address the crisis that is driving so much suffering in the region. But it's not too late, and we must not lose our hope. I therefore like to call for 3 things that must happen. First, we urgently need donors to come forward with the funding required to avert the large-scale loss of life in the Horn of Africa. We are in a race against time. as people's lives are at risk every day. The global community simply must do better. Second, developed countries who are responsible for 80% of the world's global emissions must pay the adaptation funds that they owe. Together, we must find more effective ways that these funds can be channeled to the communities that need them most, like those in Horn of Africa, whose lives and livelihoods are being upended by this drought. Third, I echo Secretary General's call for clear, time-bound roadmap on financing to avert and address loss and damage. This is very least what we owe to the parents like Rukia, who should not have to leave in their fear for the children starving. We must help to have hope again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heli. Absolutely. This meeting has to be about giving hope to people on the ground who must be feeling like they have been just left alone and abandoned to a fate that really could be avoided if more action were taken on the issues that you just mentioned. I would like to now introduce our next opening speaker. That is Abdulhakim El-Wayer, who is Assistant Director General and Regional Representative for the Near East and North Africa with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Megan. Good afternoon, everyone. We all know how desperate the situation is in the Horn of Africa. Yet another example of how those who have not contributed to climate change, with 0.59% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, bear the most of its impact. We know that climate change is a major culprit in the 5th consecutive failed rainy season. So this is the 5th in a round where the rainy season has failed to provide the necessary water for the people in the Horn of Africa to produce their food and maintain their livestock sustainably. Chronic poverty, prolonged insecurity, and conflict has made the region even more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Governments, FAO, and many other organizations and agencies have mobilized to respond and save lives. This work will continue. But we must start acting to avoid such situations in the future. Prior to this crisis, the alarm bells were rung. We could see this drought turning into a humanitarian catastrophe. We didn't do what we should have done. In 2021, FAO called for immediate action as part of its anticipatory strategy to prevent loss of livelihoods. Unfortunately, funding shortfalls meant the response in 2021 was insufficient, as it was in the previous year, as it will likely be again this year. It's time to change our approach, so let us talk about how can we do that. All colleagues and participants, before becoming a humanitarian crisis, a drought in the Horn of Africa drylands is first and foremost a livelihood crisis. Livelihood crisis must be addressed in advance with disaster and risk management measures. Such early actions include cash transfers to vulnerable households, animal protection measures, including vaccination, and provision of fodder and supplements. For pastoral communities, there is simply no way to stay alive without livestock. These are measures we can take when a drought is looming. But we need to also ensure communities are stronger and better equipped to face droughts not yet on the horizon. Land degradation and desertification reduce the resilience of ecosystems and livelihoods. So restoration of forests and regarded or degraded pastoral land is crucial to sustain livelihoods, food, feed, and energy. Biodiversity is as important as social and human capital. So sustainable management of natural resources should be part of the resilience equation. Sustainable agriculture and agroforestry interventions are key, including work on breeding and dissemination of drought-resilient crops. Yet agriculture, forestry, pastoralism, and livelihood diversification support is still underfunded and under-regarded. This must change. Leaders in the region must also look hard at how to resolve conflicts, local and regional. When there is conflict, interventions that build resilience to drought can't happen. Droughts then cause more conflict. And round we go. There will always be droughts. We cannot stop droughts, but at least we can stop famine. They will get stronger, and climate change intensifies it. But they only become catastrophes when we do not act on the warning and drivers. Just as we know what is unfolding in the Horn of Africa, we know how to stop future crises. We must invest in restoration, sustainable management of resources, and sustainable agriculture. We at FAO orient a lot of our early warning system to help anticipatory action in the region in a more well-planned manner. We're currently working with the League of Arab States, with the UN agencies, to launch a call for support to the Horn of Africa with a focus on Somalia in the coming month in order to help eradicate some of these emerging emergencies. If we don't, we will be back here in 10 years having the same conversation and asking what we could have done differently. And many, many more people will have died just because we did not plan ahead. So we look forward to the outcome of how we can strengthen our efforts in order to bring more attention to the region and provide a more systematic, coordinated intervention to support the region. I thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that very clear call to action, Mr. Envoy. It's extremely clear that we do know what to do. There is so much knowledge and expertise, but when it comes to implementing that, there is a shortfall and people are being failed, and we cannot allow that to continue. Thank you so much to our two speakers for opening remarks. We'll go to a panel discussion after this, but before that we're going to watch a video prepared by the UN Office for Humanitarian Affairs about the situation in the Horn of Africa. Just putting that on for you now.
dadka xoolihii ka soo wada dhammaadeen baan nahay 5 beri baan soo soconay halkan baan imaanay uga xanuunsaday shuban iyo mantag buu lahaa halkan baan keenay alxamdulillaah rabbil caalamiin ma eego wuu ii fiican yahay.
We are getting here a lot of malnourished children. This drought is the worst drought that we have seen for the last 20 years.
sama ko walu re kalau tu yang tan jadang ramana bungi ni boy kalau tu kalana bonce ramana bungi ni boy kalau ala kwani nyanga me lawa to bong kalau nak ujian bocek ya kata kerja ni bocek itu ni boy itu kama itu berni
ayo sih kamu dilihat tahu kamu dilihat abaartan mid lamid ah da'dan aan joogo sama marin abaartan wax lamid ah da'dan aniga hadda aan joogo 70 jir baan ahay sama marin
rataabad jarno hoolo dhaqad jarno hoolagii beero roob la'aan laan ku qay hoolo dhammaadeen abaaro dhammaatay soo joogto
That was good in the sense that we were able to hear some of the voices of the people who are being affected by this emergency on the ground. And now we're going to discuss what some of the response measures are that are being taken both in Kenya and also more regionally in Africa, and also hear a little bit about how these COPs can respond and help in terms of pushing forward a stronger emergency response. So on my left, I have 3 speakers. The first one is Lieutenant Colonel Harid Hassan. Sorry, I hope you can hear me all right. The CEO of the National Drought Management Authority of Kenya. Next to him is Dane McQueen from the Office of the United Arab Emirates Climate Envoy, and obviously COP28 will be taking place in the UAE. And next to him we have Dr. Olufunso Somorin, who is the Regional Principal Officer for Climate Change and Green Growth Program at the African Development Bank. So I'm just going to ask each of you a question, and then we'll have a little bit more of a discussion between us. Let's start in Kenya. Harid, I was in a press conference this morning where somebody from ActionAid Kenya was outlining how women and girls are very severely impacted by the drought crisis in Kenya, especially girls, because they're being taken out of school in order to have to go and fetch water, and then this basically leaves them open to risks such as early marriage and other kind of sexual and domestic violence, which on Gender Day here at COP was a sobering thing to hear. I know that Kenya has a lot of experience in dealing with climate change and humanitarian emergencies, and also has a very interesting climate finance system that allows climate finance to be cascaded down to the local level, to the county level in Kenya. So I'm just wondering if you could fill us in a little bit on some of the key programs and measures that Kenya is taking, both right now and in the longer term, to deal with the climate threats. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, Africa contributes to less than 3% of the pollution responsible for climate change, but it is mostly affected by the climate change. The Horn of Africa, including Kenya, is experiencing the worst drought situation in 40 years. This is as a result of 4 failed rains, and the 5th rain is expected to be depressed, rather failed. This has contributed to 20.9 million people who are highly food insecure. Back in Kenya, the current drought situation has resulted to displacement of millions of people, with about 4.35 people who are food insecure. The drought has brought about loss of livelihood as a result of livestock mortality, which stands at 2.5 million, which is worth about $15 billion. the declining prices of livestock. The price of livestock have declined. Pastoralists, which occupy about 80% of the landmass in the country, are not able to dispose of the animals. Also, there is widespread crop failure in the semi-arid areas. And as a result of other shocks, the Ukraine, there is high prices of consumer goods. This has a negative impact as a country. In terms of the drought, we have 23 counties which are called the ASAL, that is arid and semi-arid. Out of these 23, 21 counties are in drought mode. 14 are on alarm, drifting toward emergency. 7 are on alert, and only 2 counties are on normal mode. What does that translate to? It translates to 4.3 people who are food insecure. And for the first time, an additional pockets of 45 wards in 9 counties, which are not in the traditional ASAL or arid and semi-arid, have been affected by drought. And these contribute to about close to 1 million people who are food insecure, who are outside the bracket. The arid and semi-arid regions in the country comprise of 85% of the country, and this is the landmass that have been affected. We also see 942 million children below the age of 5 years, and 135,000 pregnant and lactating mothers having an acute malnutrition, which implies they require attention. So by and large, the impact of the drought has affected the various sectors, the livestock sectors, the agriculture sector, the wildlife sector. For the first time in the Kenya history, we are doing water tracking for the wildlife animals. Animals are dying in high number, the elephants. So the government has resorted to do water tracking for the animals. We're also seeing wildfires, which is on the increase. We also have a challenge in terms of the vegetation deficit as a result of the drought. And the issue of peace and security has been severely affected. Communities, inter-counties, intra-counties, and intra-state fighting as a result of the scarce of the resources. We have also discussed the issue of migration, people being displaced, and during this migration, the most affected are women and children. Women bear the brunt of this drought. Men migrate and leave the women behind and children. Children drop out of schools, and this has brought about a challenge in terms of retention of children in schools. But the question we need to ask is, what have we done as a government? As a government, we have done a number of interventions, and these are the issue of cash transfer, which the government, together with partners, FAO, WFP, USAID, and other partners are undertaking to support the vulnerable, the very vulnerable communities. We are also doing water intervention in terms of repair of the boreholes, supply of water to the community, as well as school feeding program to the schools with a view to retain the children in school. We also undertaking a high-level malnutrition and healthcare outreach to reach to each and every part of the country in order to assess the situation and undertake the intervention. The wildlife intervention I had already discussed. The peace and security dialogue is being undertaken within the counties and intra the counties in order to encourage the people to accommodate each other during this time of need so that we reduce the conflict. But all these hinge around what is called the early warning for early intervention. So the government has improved the early warning systems so that we trigger the early warning to enable early response. This drought is worse drought as compared to 2010, 2011, 2012. But in terms of impact, it has been reduced. This is a result of coordination with the various actors, and which has enabled for targeted response. What we need now is resource mobilization. As a government alone cannot address this issue of drought, and that's why partners have been brought on board to assist in resource mobilization to address the situation before it gets out of hand. When you look in terms of the outlook for March, April, May, we foresee a depressed rain. What does that translate? Then the situation will continue to worsen. The current rain looks depressed. Up to now, there's slow onset. This therefore calls on continuous support in order to mitigate the drought situation before it goes out of hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's encouraging to hear the measures that have been taken by the Kenyan government in order to help people. But I was just thinking, you know, you've FAO and also yourself have spoken a lot about pastoralists and how the herders are being very badly affected by this drought. And yes, it would be good to see more representatives of those communities here at COP27. I don't think I have met anybody yet from a pastoralist community in the Horn of Africa. Maybe that's just because there's so many people here. But anyhow, Dane, could you please explain to us a little bit about how UAE, as the host of the next COP, is planning to support communities in countries like Kenya and Somalia? It sounds as if the emergency there, you know, may be going on well into next year, and so clearly there will be a need for some kind of direct response from the climate talks.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting us and for bringing this conversation to COP. I think historically we've let adaptation and loss and damage be very abstract, and it's really valuable to come and say, look, this situation, these people are being affected right now. My feeling with COP is that this is largely a communications moment and some decision making, and so weaving a humanitarian crisis into that experience of COP is very, very important to have this, you know, we're all here to be influenced by each other, and this is the way that we do it. I'm personally skeptical about COPs as a fundraising mechanism. I mean, we were even thinking as a team, like, do you bring a pledging conference, you know, to the COP? I don't know that that's quite right, but I do think that there are a few areas where COPs can be very influential on this political consensus and awareness building. I think one of the ones that's coming up quickly and where we really want to lean in next year is this idea of climate finance for highly fragile and conflict-affected countries. We have, you know, there's some different numbers out there, but there's basically proof now that, you know, very, very little climate finance goes to these countries. And this is in some cases like 80 times less than other developing countries which already don't have enough climate finance. So we want to have an awkward conversation about this at COP28. There's a lot of sensitivities because, you know, this is often framed as a zero-sum game, and so are you taking money away from other developing countries? But clearly there's a problem where these countries probably would benefit the most from climate finance, from investment in food and water and resilience and nature-based solutions. It's not happening. And there's a huge outfall from that, both in terms of lives and of the cost of instability. So this is something we really want to make people talk about, even if there's not a great solution right now, but this is maybe the process to get to that sort of solution. The second thing that I think COPs can be really good for is normalizing some of the tools that humanitarian actors have come up with in the last few years. So anticipatory action is the really obvious one. This has been proven in the field. This is a great approach, even when and just for reference, most of you probably know this already, but this is releasing resources based on a credible forecast. So if you know a drought is coming in 3 months, why wait for the drought to hit? Send the money out now, for instance, through cash transfers. And COP can be a good way to just make that feel like it's, you know, part of the toolbox. It's not something that's risky or new, which is often what happens when people outside the community hear about it for the first time. So we want more voices saying, look, these approaches that humanitarian actors have piloted over the last few years are working, and we support them as part of the response to climate change. So those are my kind of two thoughts on how we can maybe use COP to amplify the work that humanitarian actors are doing and to really put a human face and a financial face on these crises in relation to loss and damage and adaptation. Thank you.
I think that will be a very welcome message for people in this room to hear, because I think, you know, there has been a lot of work on anticipatory action, for example, but, you know, it's now kind of getting to the stage where it could be scaled up. And so, you know, the ability to kind of actually address those kind of things in COP, I think would, you know, raise the profile of it dramatically. And also this issue around it's easy to do climate adaptation work and disaster risk reduction in some more secure, where there is security, but in places where there is conflict, it's really, really hard. And then that raises this, the huge risk that, you know, some countries will get the help that they need and others will just be left to their own devices and sort of in a downward spiral and a kind of climate adaptation apartheid where, you know, it's not possible for agencies to operate, or, you know, it's just a dire situation and people just don't know how to address it. So I think that would be a really interesting discussion if COP28 can address that next year. So we'll look forward to hearing more on that. Now I'm going to go to Dr. Olufunso Somorin from the African Development Bank. Obviously, the AFDB works on drought and also very interesting involvement in the Great Green Wall program. Our FAO speaker mentioned the importance of forests and nature-based solutions, and obviously ecosystems, healthy ecosystems are really, really important to helping people be more resilient to drought when it happens. So could you explain to us a little bit more about the work that you're doing in this area and how that can help to avoid humanitarian emergencies like we're seeing now?
Thank you. Very good afternoon, everyone. I think the advantage of being the last speaker is you can easily say I agree to what everyone has said. And indeed, I think the main points have been identified. I have to say thank you to the organizers for inviting us. And I think it speaks to the whole notion of bridging the divide between the humanitarian and the development actors on the ground. I'd like to start by saying that we're beginning to see a practice where almost every drought we're dealing with is called the worst drought in history. The one we dealt with 2 years ago was called the worst drought in history. The one before that was called the worst drought in history. And that speaks to the severity and the frequency that we're dealing with these challenges. And when you put that into context, it means that the time that it takes us to respond to them is way compared to the severity of the impact on the ground. There's a mismatch there, and that's the scale of the challenge that we're dealing with on the ground. But also it's important to amplify the fact that in the drought crisis that we're currently experiencing in the Horn of Africa, it's not just the crisis on its own, but it's also the impact on triggering other potential crises. We're beginning to see scarcity of resources leading to potential conflict. We're beginning to see also a huge inequality on the rise. And this has caused impact for food insecurity and the others. But I also want us to just, as we hold our thoughts on the risk and the challenges, which we cannot ignore, but the other side of the coin is to appreciate the opportunities that are in this region. The Horn of Africa, for most of you who may not know, is one of the most integrated regions in the continent on trade, on infrastructure, but also it's also one of the regions with some very good institutions. The East African Community, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, that are really on the ground, that are pushing things. And so it's very important to see how do we look at the challenges, address them, but also amplify the strength and the things that are working in the region. And that has been the entry point of the development approach by the African Development Bank. And let me put this in context. For the bank, on average within this region, development investment is about $2 billion every year across multiple sectors. And so you were not going to have the chance to do development work and then do resilience work or climate change work separately. So what our approach at the AFDB is to mainstream both climate change and resilience in all our operations across all sectors, but also across all ecosystems and spaces in the region. And by doing that, a lot of our own traditional capital is going into the work around adaptation, resilience building on the ground. The second thing is also to recognize a specific approach to drought management. And what we did about 15 years ago was to do a very deep and engaging a needs assessment together with these regional institutions I talked about. And by investing and thinking about a 20-year horizon period, what kind of investment do we need to do? A long-term development thinking within the narratives, within the realities of humanitarian actions in the short to medium term as well. And that's what we did by developing a drought resilience and sustainable livelihoods program. And many of you may be aware that within this program, across about 5 countries, the bank has invested about $1.2 billion. And it's an ongoing. We will have them in phases, and we keep expanding that. And it's looking at ecosystem management, it's looking at agriculture, it's looking at trade, it's looking at investment that can trigger improvement in economic livelihoods. What I need to say, and I want, in the interest of time, is a bit of the lessons that we've learned. And I'll share 3 of them. The first is to recognize that we need to do big things within a short period of time. And it's not very easy. So it's combining scale and speed together. And that's something that's very, very important. Number 2 is also to recognize the need that we, beyond saying it, we really entrench complementarity between the actions of the humanitarian actors and the ones of the development actors. That complementarity is very important. And I'll give you an example. It's important to do this humanitarian response within your programs there can be very much as part, activities within the development work that's going. But also it's important to see how do we have critical marks of coordinated actions. And please, let's say this, there are a lot of investment going in the Horn of Africa. There are a lot of actions going, but oftentimes they are not very coordinated. And so how do we coordinate these critical mass of actions that help us to match early warning system with early actions? And that is something the bank continues to use its convening power to bring actors around the table to be able to see how we do that going forward. And our experience in many of these countries have helped us to understand that these solutions are very possible. And we can do big things in a short period of time. And that's a partnership the bank continues to push for, working with governments and many of the partners here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It is definitely clear that there's much more joined up thinking between the humanitarian development communities now than there was, say, 10 years ago, but it's just the scale of the challenge that is perhaps, making it clear that more needs to be done there, especially if the finance were available. And I'll just leave everybody with that thought that you've mentioned about needing to do big things in a short period of time. The urgency of getting these things done is absolutely clear, and that's why it can be a bit frustrating sometimes at COP meetings where governments seem to be prevaricating on what needs to be done. But hopefully by the end of the week, we will see results that enable those things to get done. In the interest of time, we won't go to questions now. We will have hopefully 15 minutes at the end for questions. And if our speakers from the first panel are still here, people in the audience can direct questions to them at that point as well. But we need to move on to our second panel, which will be with the participation of practitioners, people working on the ground. Before that, and as we just move people on and off the stage, we're going to watch a video from the World Food Programme on this approach of anticipatory action and as it is applied in Ethiopia. Thank you. Could we have some
Hello
sound,
everyone.
please?
My name is Cosmos.
Can we have
and I
sound,
work for
please?
Candlelight
Can we start it again, maybe?
Somaliland. So please describe how NGOs are working in hard-to-reach areas. NGOs in Somalia are working under challenging and unpredictable circumstances to respond to humanitarian crises in remote and hard-to-reach areas. Communities in hard-to-reach areas receive support from NGOs that include the provisions of programs such as emergency response, resilience building, cash transfers, WASH, basic support, agricultural assistance, support for IDPs, GBV support, and overall assistance to help improve the livelihoods of those most vulnerable and affected by climate change. Local NGOs frequently take the risk to reach such remote communities with support from international agencies and donors. Local NGOs typically have developed relationships with communities and government departments, facilitating their access to hard-to-reach communities, allowing interventions to permeate easily and cost.
Sorry, I must apologise. There's been a slight change in the program. I didn't realize we were supposed to be playing a WFP video. However, instead that was actually an intervention from Cosmusa from Candlelight Somalia, an NGO that works on various development and environment interventions, because her internet is not working, and so yes, that was supposed to be a recorded video, but now are we having the... Right, okay. All right, now we're having the WFP video. Sorry about that, everybody. This is a real-time adaptation.
I'm here in Gode, Ethiopia, where WFP is delivering forecast-based anticipatory action programs to thousands of families. Extreme weather is driving hunger around the world. Climate-related disasters are no longer a surprise. Advances in science, technology, and humanitarian coordination means they are now much easier to predict. WFP uses weather forecasts to anticipate, mitigate, and prevent the impact of climate emergencies on vulnerable communities. By acting before a crisis unfolds, we can stop it in its tracks.
iyo hawadan iyo waqtigan maanta saadaasha abaar adag baan soo maray aad u adag eedana weli shakigii iyo dareenkii baa nagu jira wax weyn oo kaga baxnayna ma hayno dhulku weli waa abaaro wuu ooman yahay roobku weli madciin yarun baa nagu daadeen naguma diin waxa weeyaan aad iyo aad baanu u shakisanahay ilaahay baa naga bixin kara.
When forecasts from July and August this year predicted a drought, WFP triggered 3 anticipatory actions. We informed the local community of the forecasted drought and shared ways to cope to reduce the impact on their land, livestock, and most importantly, their families.
The communities are getting a message about their livestock, how to save their livestock during the drought, and also how to save their households by keeping food.
WFP provides cash transfers to help families prepare for the drought. They can buy nutritious food for their families and protect their assets and livestock.
One thing that we are trying to ensure is that every woman of this community is able to receive cash through different delivery mechanisms.
hay'adda WFP gargaarka ayna siisay waxay ii taraysaa xaafadayda gudaheeda marka aan idhaahdo xaafadayda raashinka baan u gadayaa khudaarta baan u gadayaa wixii lagu darayay raacayaan u gadayaa maryihii baan u gadayaa caruurtii kabahaan u xidhayaa shaambaday ku qabaysanayeen tii dharka lagu dhaqayay waan ku noolaanaynaa.
In the Somali region of Ethiopia, WFP is supporting fodder production to help reduce potential livestock loss from the predicted drought. the region has already experienced huge losses in livestock due to a lack of pasture and water caused by previous droughts.
What you see here is an embankment that we have built in this location to make sure that water stays for a long period of time, helping to recharge underground water to rehabilitate this rangeland that helps communities and who depend on livestock to have feed for the livestock in the next 6 months.
The climate crisis is no longer a glimpse into the future, but the daily reality for this community. Investment in climate action must increase. It must prioritise helping communities adapt to the changing climate and prevent losses and damages on the front lines of the crisis. We must stop predictable climate hazards becoming humanitarian disasters.
So that was a very concrete example of work being done on the ground in Ethiopia. So I'd like to invite up our second panel, which is Debra Roberts, who is one of the 6 co-chairs of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who was working on the adaptation report for the 6th assessment that came out earlier this year. And then we will also have Gonolaganda, who's Director of Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction for the World Food Programme, and also Gautam Narasimham, who is Global Lead for Climate, Energy and Environment with the United Nations Children's Agency, UNICEF. So we'll just hear from them briefly, and then we will throw it open for questions. I hope we'll have 10 minutes or so. And if we have time, we'll listen to Kos Musa's intervention again, because I think maybe people weren't able to hear it very well because it was a little bit confusing. Sorry about that. So, Debra, we're going to start with you, climate scientist and also someone who works in government who has practical experience because you're head of the Sustainable and Resilient City Initiatives unit in eThekwini in South Africa. First of all, could you tell us briefly what the latest IPCC report tells us about some of the ways that Africa is going to need to adapt to climate threats in the coming years?
Thanks, Megan. Can everyone hear me? Okay, is that any better? Great, excellent. So just in terms of the report which we released in February of this year, looking at issues of adaptation, we're really clear that the climate risks we're experiencing in Africa shouldn't only be considered in terms of the climate hazards. So in the case of the Horn of Africa, we've got the drought, we've got extreme heat, but we need to pay close attention to issues of vulnerability and exposure as well. And if you look at the adaptation options that are called out for Africa as a continent and a region that is assessed, these look very closely at responses that obviously are gender sensitive, that address developmental needs, so the provision of basic services, the option to access climate services and early warning systems as an important option in particular regions around the continent. The use of ecosystem-based adaptation. Many of our communities are still very heavily dependent on ecosystems. So both in rural and urban contexts, the use of blue and green technologies to assist with adaptation in those particular areas. But perhaps the most important message from the report is adaptation by itself is no longer enough. I think, as we heard in the previous panel, finance by itself is no longer enough. We now have systemic challenges which require systemic solutions. And in fact, in our assessment, we've moved away from talking just about adaptation to talking about climate resilient development. And this really includes a consideration not only of adaptation, but ambitious mitigation, because only through ambitious mitigation can we keep the maximum number of adaptation options open. but also with a view to achieving sustainable development so that we can look at equity and humanitarian issues. So I think that's an important part of the analysis. But if we're going to drive that much more systemic approach, then we're going to have to look at things like research. We've got to understand the problems in Africa. Currently, only about 4% of research spent on climate change globally goes to Africa, and only 1% of that goes to African researchers. So you can see the problem. If we need evidence-based solutions to systemic problems, we really need to get ahead of the game and invest in research that is appropriate. We also need to acknowledge that, particularly in an area like the Horn of Africa, scientific knowledge is one way of understanding the world, but indigenous knowledge and local knowledge are key. And so we need to create opportunities to bring in that alternative knowledge. We also need to look at climate literacy. Climate literacy can be as low as 5% in the sub-regions in Africa, which means people do not understand the link between what drives climate change and the impacts they're feeling. And that, of course, is going to impact on policy development if that is not understood. Governance is critical, and this really draws on my experience at the local government level. Unless everyone is sitting at the table making decisions in relation to problems they've helped identify, you're not going to get the systemic approach that is necessary. So I wonder how many of the people we've seen in the videos today are actually not just standing in a line waiting to receive support, but actually coming to the decision-making table, and this is a vital part of what we suggest. Legislation, obviously important to coordinate within government, but difficult to move forward on legislation if you're dealing with an area that is prone to conflict. Ecosystem-based adaptation is absolutely vital. We talked to the relationship in our report between human, natural, and climate systems, and the financing gap, particularly in adaptation. At this point, the adaptation that's been, or the financing that's been accessed for adaptation in Africa is billions of dollars lower than it needs to be. So it's a complex package, but at the same time, Africa needs to be driving forward an agenda of ambitious mitigation, because if we do not do that, we will encounter the limits to adaptation that our report indicated. We can no longer adapt our way out of this problem. There are limits, even if we put our best adaptation in place. And we're already experiencing losses and damages. And for this part of Africa, we may see the dials actually turn from adaptation to losses and damages under those circumstances. Yes. Thanks so much, Megan.
Absolutely, Debra. I really hope that doesn't occur. But also something that was interesting in the report was there are hard limits to adaptation and soft limits to adaptation. And we're really coming up against some of the soft limits now, because it's a lack of finance and weak governance and those kind of issues, which really would be a tragedy if we couldn't overcome some of those soft limits. So yes, I'm hoping that maybe in the next few years that will be something that this process can basically address. So Gautam, we're going to go to UNICEF now and hear a little bit about some of the challenges as they specifically relate to children who we heard earlier are suffering some of the worst impacts of this drought, and that will continue to affect their future and possibly the rest of their lives, actually, if there isn't enough action taken now. Thanks.
Absolutely, and there's a point you made. We've seen some of these figures. There are close to 15 million children in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia that are at risk because of the drought that is happening in the Horn of Africa. And as you laid out, it's first of all, it's just the immediate impact that it has on their lives. But when we speak of it, yes, it is about food, it is about water, but it is also about diseases that are on the rise because of things like contaminated water supplies. And it's not only about children who don't have enough food and therefore will not survive, but for example, when it comes to cholera, a child that is malnourished is 11 times more likely to die because they are malnourished. And finally, as you said, once children sort of drop out of school, I mean, at the last time we looked at it, when 90% of the children whose education was disrupted, in the case of the last drought, are very unlikely to return to school. So if you look at Somalia, today, there are close to 300,000 children, half of whom are girls, who may never go back. And part of the question then is, yes, we know how dire the situation is, but what can we do about it? What kind of solutions are we talking about? The tragic part of it is there are so many things that we know do work. We know that, for example, just being able to reach children with with treatment for acute malnutrition saves incredible numbers of lives. And this is something that we have done, I think, just in about 3 months with close to 300,000 children. We know that cash transfers, as we saw from the video before, have an incredible ability to be able to avoid the worst impacts of this. And why is it that we can't scale these things up? I mean, some of it we know. Some of it we know in terms of, we know that, for example, being able to put in better data systems for anticipatory action. Some of the work that we do in UNICEF is to put in a network of groundwater monitoring stations. We know how that really helps. And it yields results, because when you link that with deep water mapping, areas where you've done this the third time the drought failed are doing better. But these are systemic issues. These are systemic issues. We can talk about the data. We can talk about the importance of making sure that policies around climate are integrated across both humanitarian development. But as I think it was Dane, what really needs to happen is a much better conversation about how to bring the finance streams for climate adaptation, and we can call it loss and damage, but humanitarian action also together. And this is a question of two things. One is about drastically expanding the pie. 20% of finance and climate goes towards adaptation, a much lower fraction to the Horn. When we talk about humanitarian appeals, half of them, it's unfunded by at least half. So there's something about, first, the pie has to expand. The second is there has to be better integration between those pies. There are some of the things that we do in Ethiopia with humanitarian funding for groundwater that leads to longer-term resilience. And when you're talking about humanitarian funding being able to be used for resilient recovery, but right now those silos are still too strong. And expanding the pie, then making better use of the pie, and finally also, when it comes down to it, there really has to be a better conversation about understanding that that there are more efficient ways of using money. There are better ways of being able, for example, to use risk transfer mechanisms to be able to have a better addressing of how people work. And actually, at UNICEF, we're doing something around cyclones. The Today and Tomorrow initiative, and WFP does a lot. But it still, in the end, comes down to there isn't enough money. This pie needs to expand, and we really have to be able to stop thinking about humanitarian action and climate change adaptation as two different streams.
Yes, I think that's becoming increasingly clear. And Geno, I'd like to ask you about WFP's experience, because WFP has, been one of the pioneers of some of these kind of different ways of funding humanitarian action so that it has a longer term effect in terms of building resilience in communities. And could you just tell us what you're doing? I mean, obviously we heard about what's happening in Ethiopia, but a little bit more broadly in the Horn of Africa, and then more generally, where you think this needs to go.
Thank you very much, Megan. Thank you for being here. Maybe first and foremost, I want to thank everyone who is in this room, because this is a conversation about loss and damage. And I think this is where the rubber hits the road, and more people are in a trade fair rather than looking into the issue that we have and also looking at the solutions we have available. I should maybe also add that the humanitarian system operating in the Horn of Africa these days is in a very different situation than the humanitarian system that used to work based on disaster management cycles, where you had an event, then you went out, you assessed the needs, you had a recovery phase, a rehabilitation phase, and then a learning phase ideally, and then you start again. Here, there is no recovery between the cycles. It's basically impact after impact after impact after impact. So there is a ladder of vulnerability. When you are a household that was comparably well off, you made it maybe through the first failed season, and then the second one pushed you into these negative coping strategies, basically pulling children out of school, selling your livestock, selling your assets. And then maybe in the third failed season, you became one of the people who were dependent on external assistance. Other households made it into the fourth, but now we're in the fifth. So we need to work in a way that the humanitarian response is so much more protracted. And let's also keep in mind the Horn of Africa is the region in the world where fragility and displacement is really very prominent. So this is not only a climate disaster, it's a compound emergency that is protracted, where basically the humanitarian system keeps running after shock after shock after shock. And the programs that are so important for resilience building, they need to be run in parallel. Our problem is that the more people are transitioning through this ladder of vulnerability, the more pull is on the humanitarian system and the less money is available for resilience building. And resilience building is the only parallel rail on which you can then really try to put a block in that ladder. No, similar to what we have seen, you know, you build safe havens for livestock. So we are in, I would say, a really vicious cycle here. The humanitarian system needs to innovate. And examples like you have seen, anticipatory action in WFP is one, I think, very important way to innovate. But once you're in a situation like in the Horn, you're already in the middle of a whirling river. You're just playing catch up. And so maybe one message or something that we have learned is the climate finance that is missing from the most fragile and vulnerable countries, what we have heard from Dane before, these investments need to happen now, because, I mean, Pakistan says what happens in Pakistan doesn't stay in Pakistan. It's the same here. What happens in the Horn of Africa doesn't happen in the Horn of Africa. It has these knock-on effects. It will break the back of the international aid system if we fail to deploy climate finance in the most fragile settings in a very strategic way. And I'm not saying, you know, that the humanitarian system should be fundraising through loss and damage for risk absorption. I'm saying that loss and damage financing should be invested strategically in systems, early warning systems, anticipatory action systems, getting climate finance to smallholder farmers, nature-based solutions, before the humanitarian delivery and operational capabilities are needed to feed people who are already in harm's way.
That's a very, very clear message. And I've also written stories about how, you know, the pressure's being piled on the humanitarian system. It's just not possible for the aid agencies to take up and do all this work and bear all the strain by themselves. I mean, I think a couple of maybe positive things that have come out here at COP27 is that the Secretary General announced this initiative that the whole world should be covered by early warning systems in 5 years' time. And then I heard Google talking about how they delivered 150 million early alerts to people in India and Bangladesh for flooding last year, and are going to step up that work. But then also that today there was the launch of the Global Shield on climate risk, which is supposed to be providing things like insurance, social protection, and other kind of ways to cushion people and protect them from emergencies. So if those initiatives can really deliver on what they've promised, then maybe that will fill some of the gap that you've just been talking about, Geno. I think that we should listen to the intervention from Musa from Candlelight, Somalia, if we can, because she is somebody who is working on the ground in Somalia, and I know for a fact that Andrew Harper from UNHCR, who is going to deliver the closing remarks, has stated in a press conference here that it's a real shame that we're not hearing more voices from people in affected countries. So Andrew, I won't steal too much time from you, but we're going to listen to Cos now.
Hello everyone, my name is Cos Musa and I work for Candlelight, an NGO based in Hargeisa, Somaliland. So please describe how NGOs are working in hard-to-reach areas. NGOs in Somalia are working under challenging and unpredictable circumstances to respond to humanitarian crises in remote and hard-to-reach areas. Communities in hard-to-reach areas receive support from NGOs that include the provisions of programs such as emergency response, resilience building, cash transfers, WASH, basic support, agricultural assistance, support for IDPs, GBV support, and overall assistance to help improve the livelihoods of those most vulnerable and affected by climate change. Local NGOs frequently take the risk to reach such remote communities with support from international agencies and donors. Local NGOs typically have developed relationships with communities and government departments, facilitating their access to hard-to-reach communities, allowing interventions to permeate easily and cost-effectively. The impact of climate crisis on the livelihoods and well-being of Somali communities. Climate change and natural disasters are increasingly afflicting hard-to-reach communities who already receive little to no interventions. As a result, land degradation and droughts are expelling alarming numbers of residents from their communities. This is expected to get worse until communities receive the vital support to help their resilience to combat climate change or to help with climate change mitigation. Droughts and floods are the most common climate disasters inflicting remote areas and destroying biodiversity. The impacts of climate change on livelihoods lead to a lack of water availability for human and livestock consumption and for farming and agricultural production. With limited agriculture and animal production, many families have lost their livelihoods and are increasingly finding themselves subject to poverty, insecurity, and displacement. Climate change and natural disasters are causing deterioration in public health and well-being. Escalating numbers of children are affected by impaired growth due to malnutrition. School feeding programs and initiatives to help the nourishment of children are active in parts of Somalia. Such programs indicate the devastating impact of climate change on society at different levels. Because of Somalia's economic reliance on natural resources and livestock, they are especially vulnerable to climate afflictions. The current drought in Somalia is reported to get worse, and in brink of famine, the reliance of emergency response is unparalleled. Somalia's pool fund is managed in a way that allows fair and equal access to funding. The pool fund works flexibly to improve strategic focus on effective and efficient distribution of resources where most needed. Tailored and vital to humanitarian support is facilitated to reach the most vulnerable and hard-to-reach communities in a timely manner. The pooled fund allocates 25% of all its funds to local organizations. This empowers grassroots movements to work in their communities more efficiently with the support of international organizations. And we really want to stress that international and local organizations really have to work hard to find new ways to meet the needs of those most vulnerable and most afflicted by climate change. Thank you for listening, everyone. Bye-bye.
I think it's very important that we heard what COS has to say, and I think, well, I didn't know about the pooled fund being able to get 25% of the funding down to local communities in Somalia, which doesn't sound like very much, but it's more than the average, I think, for climate finance, which is 10% or maybe even less, actually going down to local level, as researchers have found. Okay, so we've heard from all of our panelists, and I just wanted to ask if anybody in the audience has any questions for anybody up here. Yep, we have one over there, and one down here, and one over there. And I think we may only have time for 3 or 4 questions, and then could you keep them very brief, please, and then we'll get our panelists to respond, just because we don't have a lot of time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name's Roger Yates from Plan International. I'd like to ask UNICEF and WFP whether they're really thinking of using the new generation of ready-to-use therapeutic foods that can be made locally and much, much cheaper to get the same effects for treating of acute malnutrition. That's using maize, sorghum and soya instead of milk and peanuts, which is the current prominent feature.
Okay, thank you. Practical question. Colleague down at the front here.
Thank you very much. My name is Tahira Mohammed. I am from northern Kenya, PhD researcher on pastoralism, uncertainty and resilience. And I had worked with pastoral communities in a place called Isiolo. My research looks at how pastoral livelihood has transformed since 1975 until 2020. And then in this research, I've seen how climate change effect has been affecting the pastoralist. And then one thing which is particular in my finding is there has been a lot of humanitarian intervention, especially food aid, and then to date climate smart intervention. But my question is, we have these interventions coming with different name, but all of it doing the same thing. And then today, 2020, you have seen the presentation how climate impact is affecting the people in those areas. So, and we've had 27 COPs. Why are we still talking about the same humanitarian crisis? Where have we gone wrong? And what do we need to do different? We need answers to this in this kind of platform. And also, one thing which is very particular is, if we define resilience, climate smart, who is defining what is resilient? Who is defining what is climate smart? So those are the things we need to include in our actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman over here.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. For me, my question is also on UNICEF representative. My name is Nyobi Morris, and I'm a youth climate activist from Uganda. I was in northern Uganda where starvation killed over 900 people this year between June and July. And I realized that it's known that this starvation cannot be defended or cannot be stopped because this region receives actually rainfall. But some of the issues that they mentioned, one was there was a locust infestation attack in 2020, and they did not get support when all the green was eaten. So they are like, we could have saved this, we could have saved our people from hunger if they had provided us with enough seeds to grow again our food, but nothing was given to them. And today I'm seeing organizations sending in food and everything, but hunger is not yet done. So what is your plan for the farmers ahead of 2023? Because I shouldn't look beyond 2023 because these same impacts are happening now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And one more question in front there, I think. The gentleman in the blue suit, yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Ahmed from ICCAD, Intergovernmental Organization in East Africa. I think it's very, very brilliant and very eloquent to listen to distinguished panelists. One question I have is particularly to WFP, Mr. Garnot. We work with WFP and we know what WFP is doing in the region. The key question I have is those great initiatives again, like the Global Shield, Early Warning for All, given that the 10% of the finance are reaching the last mile, the communities, will this make a difference? Initiatives after initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. If we could just get brief answers to those questions from our panelists, that would be great. Who would like to answer the question about therapeutic foods? Gano?
Well, maybe one thing that I can say to this is that there is an emergency treatment program and a preventative treatment program. And due to resource constraints, the emergency treatment program has received more funding than the preventative treatment program. What's important also to mention is that nutrition is woven into the response, which I think something that is something the humanitarian sector has learned. The same way, I think cash-based transfers have now been ramped up. I mean, in 2011, for example, it was 90% food aid, 10% cash. Now it's 90% cash transfers and 10% food. And that needs to be basically coupled together with nutrition programs. What I can do is after the event, we can exchange information, and if Plan International is present in the countries, we can connect you with the discussion about preventative nutrition, and happy to listen to your input.
Thank you very much. Gautam, could you perhaps respond to the question about Uganda? I think that one was addressed to you in terms of what kind of more systematic help can be provided to farmers after problems like locust attacks and so on to build their resilience. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, it's tragic that the help that was needed was. A lot of it is, as Gautam mentioned, is when you suffer from when your humanitarian appeals are unfunded, when you don't have resources to do all of the things that you want to do, you sometimes have to make these tragically hard choices. But what I would love to do is connect afterward also to give you a little more information on what was funded, what wasn't in Uganda. So would love to have that discussion.
Thank you. So I hope you will be able to get more of an answer to your question afterwards. On the two other questions, Debra, I thought it was a very valid question from our colleague at the front here about who defines resilience, who decides how someone becomes more resilient. I think that's something that you can perhaps speak to, Debra.
And that's where we need to see agencies shift from resilience being defined by international organizations who've got no local context down at the local level. And certainly in the local work in Durban, that's how we started understanding resilience. We spent 3 years talking to Durbanites and asked them what their definition of resilience is. But I think by virtue of your input, you indicated the power of science and research. And very often, I think in these crisis situations, we tend to think about the finance, the food aid, and the so on. But your research indicates very powerfully why there needs to be a partnership between the practitioner and scientific community. That monitoring of impact, that ability to call a reality check on what is happening on the ground, particularly in scenarios where we've just got impact after impact after impact. No one is standing back and having that longer term view and beginning to ask the questions that you ask. It's a very valid question. Why are we sitting here 27 years on when the science has been there essentially since the late 80s? And I think that's a powerful partnership. How do we partner the powerful science that's emerging with the powerful on-the-ground experience and draw in the research community in reality? And just for those who are interested, for the IPCC, around the IPCC work, we produced a short summary of what those 3 reports say about Africa so that you don't have to dig through 10,000 pages. I've got some copies with me if anyone's interested and wants to get a copy after the panel.
Thanks very much, Debra. And as Heli stayed up on the stage with us, I'm going to just put the final question to her. So perhaps you have some more thoughts on this definition of resilience. And it's always occurred to me that humanitarians who are working with people on the ground all the time actually, could even feed into this discussion a little bit more and bring in the people that they're working with on the ground as well. And also to address the question about how that money gets down to people and in order to be able to help them more, because aid agencies channel that finance and see how it works on the ground. Over to you.
Megan, yes, as we said, the humanitarian partners, they stay and deliver, and majority of our partners are local organizations, and over the last several years we've been focusing increasing on localization, working with the communities, working with organizations closer to the people, having our own people, our partners close to people, involving the communities in identification of the needs, planning, monitoring, and also evaluating the programs and projects. But what we're needing all this for successful localization is adequate funding. And the example from Somalia was that we had 25% of funding to the local organization, but it is not enough. It should be more. And this is something that we need to work collectively at adequate funding, but also quality funding. When the humanitarian funding in many cases is a very short-term funding, building resilience doesn't take necessary place in 6 months. And that's why there has been question on the quality funding under the grand bargain discussions that to support longer-term investments that enables the local actors and partners to engage with the communities and build the resilience and the change.
Thanks very much to our panelists on this second panel for some really interesting insights and also some good ways forward, things for everybody to think about and take forward in their own work, and perhaps hopefully some ideas that have come out of this discussion that can then feed into this COP and COPs in the future. So we're going to turn over to Andrew Harper to give closing remarks. We will steal 5 extra minutes after we were supposed to end because we started a few minutes late. And Andrew always has excellent comments on what's going on here at COP and how to link that with the work that UNHCR does on the ground. Andrew is the Special Advisor to the High Commissioner for Refugees on Climate Action. So Andrew, please give us your reflections on what you've heard here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. I think you set me up for a failure there. But I think rather than my own words, I'm going to adopt the adaptation apartheid as the theme, because how else can you explain when the needs, when the evidence, when the data, when the voices are so clear and the decisions are still being ignored? How can we have 900 people dying in northern Uganda when it's so clear? How can you have 9 million cattle dying in the Horn of Africa when we know that if somebody loses their cattle and they move, they're not going back? How can we stand here and understand when famine, it's not been declared, but it exists? When you've got hundreds of thousands of people who have been put at risk, how can we start talking about gender protection and equality when it's the women who are trying to hold the families together and are being ignored and the ones who are suffering? How can we say it's not a hate crime when we know that there's money out there, but only 4% of climate adaptation is going to Africa? All these issues need to be called for what they are. And I think, like, as you mentioned before, Megan, like, it's not sufficient to have video messages from people from Somalia. We need to have people from Somalia here. We don't need to have UN officials here talking about others. We need to have others talking about their lives. And so it's an issue when, like, it's great when we're talking about preparedness and early warning, and it's needed, but it's useless unless there's action. And that action needs resources, it needs the tools. And I've just come out of Mozambique and they said, look, like, there's plenty of plans. In Mozambique, there's 134 district adaptation plans out of 150. But there's no use to have adaptation plans unless you've got resources and you've got the tools and you've got the ownership. And so I think across the board, when we know that we're entering the 5th failed season in the Horn of Africa, what's probably more interesting is what happens if there's a 6th and a 7th. What are we doing about that? And so there's a cascading series of disasters. Let's not try and get into the typology of it. They are disasters, and you're going to have people. Luckily, some of them will be able to move and to adapt. The ones who won't be able to adapt will be the ones who are stuck there. And so you have those trapped populations. So issues across the board. On the positive side, and there is some progress here in terms of COP, because at least we are talking about people, which is not necessarily the case. I think there's 60 events talking about displacement and climate. So it is coming to the fore. There's discussions in terms of loss and damage. That's great, but there's also there's a human element to it now, which there wasn't before. So incrementally we're moving. So next year, hopefully at the UAE, we won't be here, and we'll be having the people who should be there talking. So some of the points, my takeaways in terms of being positive, certainly AFDB, I think we're all now moving away from being focused on humanitarian action as a solution. It's no longer sufficient to basically truck and chuck food or plastic blankets. It's about development. We can talk about adaptation, but it's really development. It's human security. We're starting to get that. If you don't have that, then you will be having famine, fighting, or people fleeing. Voices to the fore. Issues of Indigenous knowledge, I thought that was really quite good. Are we listening to that knowledge? Absolutely not. One of the challenges is that there's no system in place really to provide the capacity for people to be, those voices, that knowledge to be taken into account. There is also a need for this longer term vision to be associated with short-term impact. And this is where it's important to be dealing with the development plans, the bank's plans, with operational agencies, but based very much on what are the priorities of the communities. Just in the last couple of weeks, when on my trips around, had good discussions with the AFDB, also ARC as the African risk capacity. It was interesting that there's a lot of focus on, what is it, the Global Shield? Global Shield. Let's look at also the existing mechanisms. African-owned, African-run, may not be perfect, but it's not too bad. Let's see how we can start ramping up the existing things. Local as well is very much a community-based system, which is running quite well. Cash assistance, how do we do that in a much, at scale? Because like, it'd be interesting to see how much cash assistance we get to people versus the needs. So we often trumpet our own success, but I think we've got to be realistic. Financing system has to be, like, there's a lot of discussions about we can't talk about a facility. There's going to have to be something. Maybe it's not this year, but it's going to have to happen at some point. So that was basically it. Congratulations, OCHA, to getting this on board. One thing, and I'll do a self-promotion now. On Wednesday morning, we'll be having the release of the Sahel Predictive Analytics Report. And that's a report in order to bring evidence and facts to the discussions on the future of the Sahel. And it's not a UNHCR product by itself. It involves 20 institutions working together to inform policy, in future policy. Again, whenever you have a model, it's going to be wrong. But what it does do, it allows us to look at some of the other key elements which need to be taken into account. So the release of that will be on Wednesday morning at 8:30 at the Global Centre for Climate Mobility. Yalla, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. I will just close up very briefly by saying thank you so much to all of our panelists, our first two speakers, the speakers on the first panel, and also our speakers here now, for setting out the situation in the Horn of Africa, which is dire, but also pointing to the way forward. And I think it just remains for me to wish everybody working in humanitarian action in the Horn of Africa the best of luck for averting, the worst case scenario, because the people in the Horn of Africa really cannot afford for us to fail them here also at COP27. Okay, thank you very much everybody for coming, and enjoy the rest of COP. Thank you.